Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, host also of RT's talk show, Crosstalk. Well, Peter, there have been some developments since yesterday regarding the downing or the forced landing of the Athens to Vilnius flight in Minsk. One of the key developments has been that Russia has now spoken out. We had a statement issued by Maria Zakharova yesterday in which she said, surprisingly, that Belarus acted in accordance with international law. And then she made the points that Peter, you and I made yesterday about what happened to the Evo Morales' plane in 2013. And that what the West was really no business getting into a high dudgeon over this. And she cited other examples in which the West diverted flights for its own political ends. And then today, Sergei Lavrov held a telephone conversation with the Belarus foreign minister. It sounded like a warm conversation in which I'll quote what the readout from the call. Lavrov said that separately, the events related to the emergency landing on May the 23rd of this year at the Minsk airport of a Ryanair airline were touched upon. The Russian side welcomed the readiness of the Belarusian authorities to provide the necessary materials and ensure a comprehensive, thorough, and transparent investigation of the incident. So there's no real condemnation here. And I think that we really have to get into the mentality, I think, of what's going on in Russia. And we've talked about this before, Peter. I mean, that Russia is really fed up. They're fed up with all these color revolutions. They're fed up with attempts to stage coups in Belarus, the coup assassination attempt. And it's more or less saying that, if you're going to do this with Poland, Lithuania, all of the Baltic states, they're all involved in an attempt to overthrow the Lukashenko government, then this is what is going to happen. You're going to have these sorts of incidents. And one other factor which has emerged in recent days is, of course, this guy, Protoshevich, he had been in Athens attending a conference, a kind of a regime change conference. In attendance at this conference was Jeffrey Pyatt, whom we all remember as the man who took part in the famous F the EU phone conversation with Victoria Nuland. At the time, he was ambassador to Ukraine. Now he's ambassador to Greece. And so Pyatt was at this conference. It's very likely that Pyatt and Protoshevich were, had an enjoyable banter about how to affect.
He's the guy. He's the guy.
Exactly. And there's also, you probably saw, Peter, there was an article today on Moon of Alabama in which he likened what Lukashenko did in diverting this flight to land in Minsk to what the Ukrainians were planning last year. You remember there was this these Russian mercenaries who allegedly were invited to come to Syria and make a ton of money, and so they would come to Minsk, and a Turkish airliner would fly them out to get to Syria. And of course, Ukraine was planning to divert this flight, have them land in Kiev, and it would be a huge humiliation for the Russians and so on. Well, as this Moon of Alabama article says, this is Lukashenko's revenge, and revenge is a dish best served cold. Okay, Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, the Russian reaction is very measured, obviously. I think that Zakharova's readout for her interpretation echoes what we had to say yesterday, is that what Lukashenko ordered, which I condemn, is no different than what the United States does. Morales is the single best example. And in many ways, it was the Americans that set that precedent.
Right.
And so now it's a bad precedent and it's being followed. Okay.
Right.
And but what the Russian Foreign Ministry is making very clear, maybe not in the harsh terms, at least at this point, is that if you want to involve yourself in machinations in Belarus, we're watching. We're seeing exactly what's going on. And Russia, because Belarus is a strategic partner, and even in one form or another under international law, a part of Russia because they have a union treaty. That's the red line. I mean, if you want to have a forced regime change there, Russia is going to react very strongly. Because, one can say, and I think it's probably true, if we look at the beginning, this iteration of the change, forced regime change playbook, it's the forcible breakup of Yugoslavia is the ground zero. Right. And we've seen how they've tinkered with it and came out with a new iteration for Ukraine. And now they've upped the ante here and trying to apply it to Belarus. Now, let's be very clear here. We look at the very long relationship that Lukashenko and Putin have had. They're not friends. It's officially cordial, and nothing more than that. There's actually a very famous clip. I don't know if you can find it on YouTube, where Lukashenko, with his endless complaints with Putin in Russia, Putin very graciously saw him off at the airport on the tarmac, and they shook hands. And Putin is walking back. And then Lukashenko is like, well, one more thing. And he came up to Putin, tapped him on the back, and then Putin gave him the look like, don't you ever do that again. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it showed very, in one slide, it showed really, we're neighbors. That's the way it is. You're head of Belarus. I'm head of Russia. We have to have a cordial relationship. Okay. But it doesn't mean anything more than that. Right. And so obviously we're seeing NATO countries making hay of this here. You very, very brilliantly put it out yesterday. You want to try something, for every action, there is a reaction. And I would even add a caveat. For every action in this case, there's going to be even more forceful reaction because the Russian authorities do not have any allegiance to Alexander Lukashenko. They want a stable neighbor, and they don't want to create another chaotic Ukraine on their border. And it will be much harder to do it with Belarus for historical reasons. And these usual, Yats is the guy. That's the kind of intellectual aptitude that we're dealing with. Victoria Nuland, Piat, and the rest, even Joe Biden going in there with the attaboys, remember, for Yanukovych. They made a whole hash of the whole thing. The country is a hash now. And the economic realities, I mean, if you forcibly overthrow the government in Belarus and put in your surrogate, you're going to destroy this small, struggling country. And Russia holds the key, okay? Because of all the sanctions, the last dictator of Europe, et cetera, there's only one trading partner for the most part. They have a high-tech sector. I don't want to dismiss that. But the rest of the economy, it's very dependent on Russia. So these people here are playing with fire.
No, I think it's all very good points. And of course, the sums involved the EU has absolutely no idea what it's talking about. I mean, the idea that somehow, we'll just prize Belarus away from Russia, and then it'll be integrated within into sort of the Western economy. They have no idea what's involved. I mean, the Belarus economy is entirely tied to the Russian economy. For it to make this huge switch, we're talking about, billions upon billions, tens of billions of euros. They don't have it. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen said today, well, if Belarus goes democratic, we've got a $3 billion euro package waiting for it. 3 billion euros. I mean, that's just nothing.
And now we'll go for consulting fees.
Exactly. I mean, we're talking about 100 billion euros at a minimum. What's involved? I mean, the Belarus economy is so tied to the Russian economy. It's a total fantasy. And I think that, as we've talked before, For the Russians, this is, to put it crudely, use the cliche, it's an existential issue. I mean, the Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine is a major blow to them. I mean, Ukraine is a key ally, it's a brother nation, and it's a real blow to them, what has happened to them. They're not going to allow this in Belarus. I mean, that's just simply, Putin has talked about these red lines. That's a red line. They're not going to allow any kind of a Maidan type regime to take over in Minsk.
Because appetite comes with the eating, okay? Belarus, and then they set their eyes on the breakup of the Russian Federation.
Exactly.
That's obviously their end game here,
right.
Okay? And obviously, one of the things that they're, I mean, $3 billion for whom? Right. For what?
Right.
What? Okay. What? This will be a very easy question for you, George. What does Belarus make that will be accepted in the European Union? Think long.
Right, exactly.
Think hard.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And plus, you have to be aware that most working people in Belarus work for the state.
Right.
So what are you going to do? Have these vultures come in and privatize it? What is going to happen to their jobs?
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And that is why Lukashenko enjoys support in Belarus. He may not get 80%, it may not be 80% as the last election showed, but it's probably at the very least 50%, precisely because they've actually had a pretty good life under Lukashenko. The economic stability, they actually produce these manufactured goods, pretty good quality. It goes into the Russian market. They don't want the structural readjustment that demolished Eastern Europe.
And as I said earlier, one of the many times that Lukashenko and Putin have met, and Lukashenko always has this list of complaints, which is very annoying because in many ways, Russia underwrites the economic stability of Belarus. I mean, for example, there's a very famous case, people are not very aware of it, but in the waning days of the Soviet Union, a brand spanking new refinery was located in Belarus. And so what happens is Russia exports crude oil and other petroleum, petroleum. And what the Belarusians are able to do is use this refinery and refine it to kerosene, gasoline, all kinds of things. And then they sell it abroad at like a 500% jack-up price from what they paid for the crude oil. And the Russians are saying, come on. I mean, we sell you cheap oil, and then you're really taking advantage of us here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's many examples of that, because what Russia wants is to have a quiet neighborhood. And you're absolutely right. Lukashenko has a base, and he has a very strong base. It's very difficult to say what percentage it is. I'm willing to go out on the limb and say 50% plus one. Okay, I am willing to say that because so many people are dependent on the economy.
Right.
So again, this kind of turnkey, one size fits all thing, it doesn't work out very well. Okay, there's always a lot of tiers, and there's always the consultants are paid. You get these really radical fringe groups on top. Look at me. How did Poroshenko come to power? Came to power on the back of some really nasty people, and they're still hanging around. May not be in parliament, but they're in the government. They're in the armed forces. They're in the intelligence services.
No, I think that's right, and I think when the Russians, who to whom this is the nightmare, is what happened to Russia during the 1990s, and then they look at Belarus. Belarus never went through any of that, so they say, well, Lukashenko has actually been successful. He avoided that whole carpetbaggers syndrome that pervaded in Russia during the 1990s. He didn't have all those Bill Browders and Khodorkovskys making out like bandits, stealing the property of the people. So that therefore they do have a certain respect for Lukashenko. I do think it's interesting that they're not following the European lead and condemning Lukashenko. I mean, so they're basically being sympathetic. So, well, we'd like to see the result of your investigation. We'd like to know more about what was Protoshevich up to. You say that he's a terrorist. I mean, I think he is listed as a terrorist, according to the.
Extremist by the, I think.
Well, that's what I read, but I also read that he's a terrorist, and you know, so you know, that he's listed as a terrorist. So, well, we'll see about that. What I didn't know, and I got this from Moon of Alabama. And he's quoting this Ukrainian scholar who's he's in Canada, who disclosed that this Protoshevich worked for this neo-Nazi Azov battalion in Ukraine. He worked in the press service there. So therefore, you know, there he is. He's working in this neo-Nazi outfit in Ukraine. He's obviously on the payroll of, you know, European, American intelligence services. I mean, he worked for Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. Then this organization, this Nexta, I mean, this is obviously very lavishly funded. I mean, they churn out stuff, you know, every half hour. So there's a lot of money splashing around. You know, he's somebody that clearly is causing problems now. You know, you just had that coup assassination attempt. You had, before that, you had the failed color revolution. This is a very ignitable situation, and this is what happens. And to be honest, you know, Lukashenko had, you know, more basis for doing that. I mean, the Americans had no basis for doing what they did with Evo Morales. I mean, that really was an outrage. Here, there's, you know, it's not clearly, it's not exactly ideal what he did, but there's at least more of a basis for it.
Yeah, and you know, one thing I really want to stress to everyone here is you read or you're told about the Belarusian opposition. Well, number one, a lot of their major figures, as George has just pointed out, they've been educated, schooled, groomed by these Western institutions that are basically designed for forced regime change. The opposition in Belarus, like in Russia, they're annoyed because nobody wants to vote for them, okay? Right. And that's why they reach out to foreigners to do it for them, okay? And so, Navalny's not allowed to, well, there are laws. If you're a convicted felon, you can't run for office. I think that applies in the United States too, okay?
You can't even vote.
You can't even vote. Okay, yeah. I mean, there's always these double, but it's an exception because it's Russia. It's an exception because it's Belarus. It's an exception because it's Ukraine. No, you have to have principles, or you don't have principles. Right. Either you do believe in the process, or you don't believe in the process. Right. And if you're only interested in the outcome, stop talking about the process.
That's exactly right. Absolutely right. Obviously, you know, there are these sanctions, but as with always the sanctions, who's hurt by it? Ordinary people. So yeah, ban on all flights of Minsk, the Belarus airliner can't travel into any European airspace. Okay, so people traveling from Belarus will have to make a detour through Russia. Very inconvenient. It's going to cost them more money. But that's all that they're going to do. So it's completely pointless. And the Europeans, in attempting a regime change, in attempting to overthrow a government that they didn't like, have really created another mess for themselves.
Yeah, but they're creating another mess for the people that they're quote unquote trying to help. Okay. I mean, do you think people in Brussels, as they go through these machinations, that, you know, if it goes wrong, do you think they're going to say, oh, well, you know, I mean, we'll find another country? I mean, that's exactly what they do. Okay. It's a profession. It's a calling for some of them. Okay. And, you know, if you really look at, you know, we don't have time for it now, but if you look at the number of politicians in the Baltic republics, in Ukraine, Armenia, Moldova, how many of them not only are American educated, but are American citizens and have American passports?
Embarrassing. That's a great source of embarrassment. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. These are our people. Literally, your people. I mean, so yeah. No, and this was the case with all those Ukrainian leaders. I mean, from Yushchenko, the guy.
Wives.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
No, but see, this is called elite capture, okay?
Right.
And there are a lot of ways to do it. I mean, what's it called? The European Observer. I think it's just some kind of propaganda front, but they get Russians, particularly in the regions, to write articles. And it starts out like, just tell us about your region. And then, they pay them like $500 for an article. Oh, wow. And then it's, now what about this? Can you criticize this? And then finally they groom you, okay? And you get published, okay? And then little bit before you know it, you're just a pawn, because you learn to get, if you live in the regions, folks, $500 is a lot of money.
Yeah.
Okay?
Look, $500, it's a lot of money even in the United States for a piece of writing. I mean, that's a serious fee. Most sites pay nothing. So yeah.
It's very a very large web sophisticated operation here.
Right.
Okay, and I'm really glad you brought up, I want to keep a very close eye on this, because it really echoes with Ukraine. When you bring the when the U.S. backs these proto-fascist type figures, it's done on purpose, because I won't go over the entire history, but of course, Ukraine has two very different national identities. One that it's for shorthand, pro-Russian, and then the anti-Russian. Okay, the same dynamic does exist in Belarus, but on a much smaller and a much more faded level, but it's still there. Okay, and that's another kind of divide and conquer attempt. And what you do is you fly in, you parachute in a Westerner that's going to smooth everything, will get plenty of aid and all that, and that's their playbook here. And when it does happen, you start breaking the country up. And in the case of Belarus, because of the way Russia feels about Belarus and its relationship to the Union Treaty, it's not going to be Lugansk and Donetsk. It's going to be the whole thing.
Oh, it's the whole thing, no question. It'll be the whole thing. Yeah, I mean that's it's.
And how does that serve American foreign policy interests? How does that serve the foreign policy interests of the Baltic republics? How does that solve the foreign policy interests because I've never figured out what NATO's are, but how would it serve NATO's foreign policy interests?
Right.
Doesn't.
Right. It's also an interesting feature, which I think very rarely mentioned in the media, is the scale of the losses in Belarus during World War II.
The highest.
It's quite horrific. I mean, again, the media is so busy demonizing this country that they just don't even have any appreciation of the magnitude of the losses in World War II. And that it wasn't that long ago. It's still within the living memory of some people.
If we're talking about history, what was the pathway to Moscow for Napoleon? Belarus. Look at Operation Barbarossa. What role did Belarus play in it?
Right.
Okay. And in the First World War, a good part of the Eastern Front included Belarus. Okay.
Exactly. Well, exactly. That's why it is an existential issue for the Russians. And the notion, these idiots in the European Union, these Ursula von der Leyen, thinking that Russia is just going to allow some anti-Russian Maidan type regime in Minsk. And then they'll just simply say, "Oh well, hey, them that's the way the cookie crumbles." It's fantasy, absolute fantasy, and it shows that they haven't learned anything over what's happened in the past 10 years. And for them to be entertaining these coups, and thinking that they're going to haul in some people who are actually living in Lithuania, and thinking that this is somehow going to be acceptable to Moscow. Total lunacy that pervades it.
And we can finish on this, and we've talked about it when the Ukraine situation the intra-Ukraine situation was flaring up. And there is that scenario out there, and I fear it's very much in play right now, is they want a strong Russian reaction. So these fanatics in the EU and in Washington and in London, it'll give them the reason to completely cut off Russia completely from the West for a generation. And that's their goal. They want that so desperately. Somehow it'll cleanse them. It'll it would be kind of a some kind of I can't find the word, but I mean, it would be just, it's like freeing themselves of something. It's a neurosis. These people have a neurosis.
Yeah, absolutely right. All right, Peter, we will maintain our laser-like focus on the events in Belarus. And we are on Locals. Please follow us on Locals.
Thegaggle.locals.com.
Exactly, and support us to whatever extent that you can. We're also on Rumble, follow us there. And if you like The Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.